She was bright, she was friendly, she stood out in the crowd.
On December 19th, 1979, the world was Michelle Martinko's for the taking. Instead, she was taken from the world.
A holiday shopping trip to the new mall in town, a trip that ended in tragedy.
Police officers arrived to find that she had been stabbed well over 20 times. She was in a battle for her life as she was being stabbed to death.
And for decades, left a teenager's family with only memories and unanswered questions.
Are you confident that this case will be solved?
No.
This week on Killer Cases.
We were all aware of it growing up in Cedar Rapids. It was local lore. We all knew who Michelle Martinko was.
Why can't they figure this out?
How did he get away with this?
We still have a really small town-like atmosphere here. So, you know, when something happens to one of our own, we're all impacted by it.
For Vault Studios and the Law and Crime Network, I'm Brian Ross. This is Killer Cases, the podcast. 1979, a tumultuous, soul-searching year for America. A year that saw the crime rate climbing, especially in the country's smaller cities, including Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Prosecutor Nick Maybanks would later be brought in to work on the Michelle Martinko case.
Especially around here, folks thought they could just kind of go about their lives as they always had for decades here and not have to worry about the violence that happens in those bigger, cities.
All that changed in Cedar Rapids 1 week before Christmas in 1979 at the brand new Westdale Mall. A high school student was brutally murdered. Cedar Rapids police discovered her body in her car in the mall parking lot.
Our uniform division people went out there to check various places. They checked there and did, in fact, discover the body of one Michelle Martinko.
Any motive at all? Can you think of any reason why anyone would want to kill her?
No, from what our understanding is a very nice young lady. It's a sad situation. We have no idea at this point.
On that December day, back in 1979, Michelle went to the mall for some Christmas shopping. She'd been at a school choir holiday banquet and was all dressed up when she left for the ball. Michelle Martinko's sister, Janelle Stonebreaker, remembers that night clearly.
As a matter of fact, the night that my sister went to the mall, that was the first time she had ever been there and had the $180 cash on her for that evening, and she still had the money with her after she was killed.
Police say one of the last people to talk to Michelle that night was Kurt Thomas. He'd been in a school play with Michelle and was working at a men's clothing store in the mall.
We were walking and looking at each other and animated and just friendly.
Thomas walked Michelle to the mall exit.
She was saying her goodbyes. She was bundling up. She was calling it a night and going out in that parking lot. She smiled at me. I call it the Michelle smile.
Prosecutor Nick Maybanks says the next time Michelle Martinko was seen was the next morning around 4 a.m. when police officers arrived on the scene.
To find that she had been stabbed well over 20 times throughout her chest, her neck, and her arms, and that she had been brutally murdered.
Any possibility of sexual assault here?
I would at this point, and I certainly can stand to be corrected, I would say possibly not. I don't think robbery is a motive. We don't know at this time.
Michelle's family, including her sister Janelle and brother-in-law John Stonebreaker, were convinced it was an ex-boyfriend, Andy Seidel, who had killed her.
Well, we really didn't have any other suspects.
John Stonebreaker says the relationship had ended badly.
And they had broken up in a rather unsatisfactory way, and he wouldn't let go, and just seemed like the classic behavioral trait of, if I can't have her, no one can.
But detectives were also suspicious of the friend she had talked to at the mall that night. Thomas was taken to the police station even before he knew Michelle had been killed.
It turned into a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. The one thing I do remember was the good cop, bad cop. He just flat turned around, leaned over the chair, and asked me why I killed her.
But there were no surveillance cameras in the mall parking lot, no eyewitnesses, and at the time, no DNA testing was available. The case went cold.
The theories that were floating around in town, in that small town, Those were very hurtful because it was everything from drug rings to prostitution. I mean, you name it.
And for years, her family was in despair, especially her mother, Janet, subjected to ugly prank calls after the murder.
And they'd say what?
Mother, it's Michelle. Do things like that. And some of them would be laughing on the phone.
It was absolutely awful. My sister and my mother were soulmates, and so my mother just lost a part of herself.
For decades, it became a sad Christmas-time ritual in Cedar Rapids, friends and teachers gathering at the gravesite of Michelle Martinko.
And there's a lot of people in my life, I can't remember their voice, but I can always remember Michelle's laugh.
The years went by with no answers. Michelle's mother and father, Albert and Janet Martinko, died, not knowing who had killed their daughter.
I would say it destroyed a lot of their lives, certainly their peace and quiet. My little sister was their miracle baby. My mother was 44 when she had my sister.
The mother's diary, discovered later, indicated that she died thinking it was either the ex-boyfriend Andy or Michelle's friend Kurt who had killed her. But the friend would also eventually see his name in that diary.
I saw the actual notes that Michelle's mother had made. She thought it was Andy. How did he get away with this, and why can't they prove it? But she was keeping a diary, and it was very troubling to me to see her write my name and then circle it and put question marks.
I would say we were frustrated. I would say we were very anxious. Why can't they figure this out?
But for all those years, evidence from the crime scene had been sitting on a shelf at the Cedar Rapids police station. And in 2006, it was finally tested for DNA. Cedar Rapids Police Detective Doug Larison made the announcement, a breakthrough in the case.
Some of the items of evidence that we've kept have been re-examined by lab analysts, and they have found the killer's DNA.
Anyone who had been suspected or had any contact with Michelle decades earlier was now asked to submit a DNA sample.
Of course, one of the first people that the detectives looked at was the boyfriend, and they took a swab from him, and it was not a match.
But one man refused to give a DNA sample, Kurt Thomas, one of the last people to talk with Michelle at the mall that night, now married to a judge in Oklahoma.
My wife just was completely silent, and then she was, "Are you crazy? Are you nuts? The police don't call and ask for DNA just willy-nilly out of the blue."
Thomas's lawyer gave him a statement to read to the police detective who had contacted him, turning down the request for DNA.
Read my little statement, and he set the phone down. I could hear the phone going down on the desk, and he just announced it to wherever he was. "We got our effing killer. We're going to get a warrant for your DNA. We're going to get a warrant for your arrest." I've always liked you as Michelle's killer.
But after a prolonged negotiation with the Cedar Rapids police, Thomas's lawyer relented.
And I gave my DNA. And I remember they called and just said, "He's not a match," and they hung up.
And no one else was a match of the hundreds of men tested. Even the husband of Michelle's sister was tested.
They were even that thorough. So there was just nowhere to turn unless it was a total stranger. And then how do you find that person?
It was in 2015 that Cedar Rapids Police Detective Mac Denlinger took on the cold case. Denlinger was just a child at the time of the murder back in 1979.
I was probably at home in bed. In 1979, I would have been 5 years old.
He started by sorting through more than 7,000 pages of reports, including some prepared by his father, who was a detective at the time of the murder.
I have to try to find something new to do. I'm really brainstorming. How can we streamline this process?
It was Denlinger's wife who finally gave him the answer, after she received a Christmas gift of an Ancestry.com research report on her family tree that used DNA.
And at that time, it was kind of a light bulb moment for us. She mentioned, wouldn't that be neat if you could do that with your Martinko case? And I immediately recognized the potential in that. And that's how I eventually got turned on to a company called Parabon Nanolabs out of Virginia. So we actually were able to get an image of our suspect created from that DNA. They're able to create what they anticipate someone would look like from their DNA, including skin color, hair color, eye color, facial structure, things of that nature. It was pretty amazing and is not something that had ever been tried here in Iowa.
So that generated a whole new flurry of activity. They put out the picture, they had a big press release. We went into Cedar Rapids for that, and they aged the person a little bit and did different hairdos.
What I was hoping for is that we'd get 100 people call in and say, hey, it all looks like person A. But the problem we ran into is we got 200 people call in and say it looks like 100 different people.
But Detective Matt Denwinger was not giving up.
In 2018, the spring of 2018, I saw in the news that they had cracked the Golden State Killer case and arrested Joseph DeAngelo.
Police had matched the DNA found on victims in that case to a relative of DeAngelo, who had submitted her DNA to a genealogy database.
Using the most innovative DNA technology available at this time.
It led to his arrest and conviction, and a revolution in solving cold cases led by pioneers like C.C. Moore.
This technique was really only known to genealogy enthusiasts and people of unknown parentage who used it to find their birth families. We were a relatively small group of citizen scientists that created these techniques and evolved them to the point where they could really be a revolution for crime fighting.
And finally, real hope that this would be the key to solving the murder of Michelle Martinko, using a database of more than 1 million people.
So what we're looking for are people who have significant amounts of shared DNA with that unknown suspect.
And then a hit, a partial match with a woman living in Washington State.
So she was kind of our ground zero for building a family tree and working our way back to our suspect. And so we were honing in pretty quick that our suspect was likely one of 3 brothers, all living in Iowa.
People in Manchester, Iowa, and the surrounding Delaware County are proud of their small-town values, a family-friendly, safe place in the middle of farm country. And yet police were now certain that the town of 5,000 people was home for a man with a deep and dark secret.
Jerry Burns, Kenneth Burns, and Donald Burns. And they'd all grown up in the Manchester, Iowa area, which is about 45 minutes from Cedar Rapids.
If the DNA tests were correct, one of 3 brothers in the Burns family of Manchester had to be the man who had brutally murdered Michelle Martinko. After so many dead ends, Detective Matt Denwinger was finally closing in, and he called Michelle Martinko's brother-in-law, John Stonebreaker, to give the family a heads up.
Said that they had narrowed it down to 3 brothers. We were just excited beyond belief. We stopped and hugged each other and cried a little bit.
None of them had any connection to Michelle or to Westdale Mall that we could identify, so it was really tricky to tell which one we thought was most likely our suspect. Ken and Jerry still live in Manchester, and they both run different businesses. And then Donald was an entrepreneur also, and he lived down in Davenport.
In great secrecy, Cedar Rapids police detectives descended on Manchester.
We were on a lockdown. No one knew what we were doing or what we were trying to accomplish. We wanted as little information getting out as possible. We needed to collect DNA to confirm which one it was. So we had to do that covertly.
They began with the brother detectives thought was the most likely suspect, Kenneth Burns, in Manchester.
We followed him around for the better part of a day until he went and had lunch at a golf course clubhouse. And then we were able to collect a drinking straw out of his glass and send that back to the state.
The Iowa State Crime Lab at Ankeny made the case a priority and had results within days, comparing the new sample with the DNA collected off Michelle's dress 4 decades earlier.
They told us after comparison that Kenneth was not a match for our suspect.
Now to Davenport, along the Mississippi River, where Donald Burns lived.
He moved to Davenport with the bright lights in big city, and he he seemed to me like he was the most logical of the three to have done it.
The detectives waited outside his home for Donald Burns' garbage to accumulate.
And we were able to covertly collect a glass and a toothbrush out of his garbage, and we found out that that's not a match either.
Finally, back to Manchester, and the brother detectives had thought was the least likely of the three to be the killer.
And we observed Jerry leave his business around lunchtime one day, went to the Pizza Ranch buffet restaurant there in Manchester, Iowa. We decided that the straw that he was drinking out of was going to be the best item to take. And after his lunch was over, they got up and left, and we walked over and took the straw out of the glass after it was left there for trash.
Once again, a rush order for the technicians at the Iowa State Crime Lab in Ankeny.
And when we got that phone call, you know, our jaws were on the floor.
It was a match.
That was big. I wanted to leave the second I got that phone call and go arrest him, but, you know, cooler heads prevailed.
The plan instead was for Detective Denlinger and a retired detective who had worked on the case, J.D. Smith, to go back to Manchester
and see what he had to say for himself. So we walked right into the business and knocked on the door to his office.
Hey, how are you today? Jerry, my name's Matt. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Hey, I'm with the Cedar Rapids Police Department.
Oh, yeah.
No smoke and mirrors, no tricks up our sleeve. We're going to just be honest with you and see what you're willing to tell us.
Now, at the age of 64, with a full face and a friendly pet cat, Jerry Burns listened as Denlinger laid out the purpose of the visit, all recorded on an undercover camera.
We work in the cold case unit down at the Cedar Rapids Police Department, and we're following up on an old case. I don't know if you've heard it in the news at all. It's a homicide that happened at Westdale Mall. Michelle Martinko, is that something you've ever heard of?
Yeah.
First, Denlinger showed Burns a picture of Michelle.
This is a picture of Michelle. Is that anyone you ever remember seeing or anything like that?
No.
That's not a name you knew or anything like that. Okay.
He actually agreed to be interviewed for quite some time.
Detective Denlinger began to close in, telling Burns he had a warrant to collect a DNA sample from him to make sure there was no doubt.
I already knew in the back of my head that Jerry was responsible for killing Michelle. His DNA was on the dress.
And then all cards on the table.
Just spitballing here. But I'm just thinking, you know, we kind of know going in that this is probably going to be a match.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Why would that be?
Well, we were kind of hoping you'd tell us. The reality is we're not here on a whim. We're here to confirm what we already know.
Outside, prosecutor Nick Maybanks was in a surveillance van, listening to a live audio feed of the interview.
I was on pins and needles as I was listening to the interview take place.
The date chosen for the confrontation was December 19th, the anniversary of Michelle's murder. It was no coincidence.
I mean, I think in any investigation, you hope that the suspect confesses. We thought that, there could be a possibility that that date would have meaning to Mr. Burns.
Do you know what today is?
19th of December.
Did you murder someone that night, Jerry?
Test the DNA.
Jerry.
Test the DNA.
Why did this happen, Jerry?
Test the DNA.
What happened?
I don't know. I was not there that night.
You don't know why this happened?
I was not there that night.
Well, we know better than that, Jerry. You know better than that. You know I'm not lying.
He was in full denial mode about having any involvement. I didn't get quite what I wanted, which was just a full confession explanation. Maybe I was overly optimistic I could get that from him.
One last try.
Take a good look at her picture for me, please. And just really make sure in your mind that this is not someone you know.
I don't believe
or that you met.
So eventually we came to the conclusion that he's not going to provide us any more information, and we're not going to get any more evidence to connect him to Michelle. So at that time, it was decided that we were going to arrest him for the murder of Michelle Martinko.
Tonight's stunning news of the arrest decades after her murder. Authorities arrested 64-year-old Jerry Lynn Burns of Manchester this morning. He's been arrested for first-degree murder in the stabbing death of Michelle Martinko.
But once the case got to the courtroom, it was not so cut and dried. Burns' family was able to hire one of Iowa's top defense lawyers, and the reliability and the constitutionality of the DNA evidence would be put on trial.
This could not have been Jerry Burns. It just didn't make sense.
State of Iowa versus Jerry Lynn Burns.
Michelle Martinko's friends and family packed the courtroom to get their first in-person look at the man accused of the brutal murder.
The state of Iowa accuses Jerry Lynn Burns of the crime of murder in the first degree.
Jerry Burns looked like the most ordinary man you've ever met. He looked like he couldn't possibly be a killer.
I thought he would be just a monster to look at, but he was just a very low-key, average-looking kind of guy. You would have thought maybe he was in there for a parking ticket.
But if convicted, Burns faces life in prison without parole for a murder committed 40 years earlier.
Ladies and gentlemen, over the course of the next 2 weeks or so, you're going to go on a journey back in time. Michelle Martinko was a girl out on the town. She would talk to anyone she considered to be a friendly face. Those in her class, those in the concert choir with her, and those that were in music or on the twirling squad with her. Michelle Martinko, forever 18.
And as the lawyer for Jerry Burns, Leon Spies, prepares for his opening statement, he understands the emotional power surrounding the memory of an innocent teenager whose life was cut short.
And no one in this courtroom at any point is going to be critical of Michelle Martinko. There was no reason for her to die, and there was no reason for any violence to be inflicted upon her.
The prosecution begins by putting Michelle Martinko's classmates on the stand, including her one-time boyfriend, Andy Seidel.
It's hard to characterize someone as good and as pure as she was in terms of how she would treat others.
You know, Andy was a nervous wreck, understandably. Not only did he love Michelle back then, but he had went through a lot being, you know, the target of the investigations.
For years, Michelle's family had been certain that Andy was the killer. After testifying, he leaves town before Michelle's sister can talk to him.
I would have liked to have personally apologized to him for falsely accusing him for all those years and for thinking that he was capable of doing something like that to Michelle.
Next to testify is Kurt Thomas, who also had been considered a suspect and was one of the last people known to have talked to Michelle at the Westdale Mall.
I remember that night. I remember Michelle, her smile, the goodbye smile. I mean, it's affected my entire life.
And he says there was a sense of guilt that has weighed on him ever since that night.
We lived in an age of innocence, and we didn't think about monsters in the parking lot. And but it has absolutely consumed me that I didn't walk her to the car. If you'd have walked her to the car, it could have all been different.
Judge Faye Hoover Grind presided over the trial.
Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
On day 4 of the trial, lead detective Matt Denlinger takes the stand.
Nobody to this day, I think, knows more about this case, including me, than Matt Denlinger.
Denlinger describes the quest by the Cedar Rapids Police Department over the years to find the killer. Then the jury listens as Denlinger's secretly recorded confrontation of Burns is played almost in full.
In Your Honor, permission to publish and play State's Exhibit 14A, the interview.
You may.
Hey, how are you today?
Burns' lawyer later says the video evidence was the low point of the trial for their side.
Yeah, it was difficult to try to predict how the jury was reacting to Mr. Burns' questioning there at his office. The natural reaction, I think, would be to protest loudly, no, I had nothing to do with it.
And then they watched the video from the back seat of the police car with Burns under arrest, a barely audible passage when Detective Denlinger asked if he had forgotten what had happened.
I think it's possible this happened. You're not remembering it.
Burns suggested memories can be blocked out.
Things block out. I gotcha.
Prosecutor Nick Maybanks then questions Detective Denlinger on the stand about his conversations with Burns and asks a key question.
Now that we've watched all 56 minutes of this video, Matt, where in the interaction between you and Mr. Burns in the squad car does he deny killing Michelle Martinko?
He never denied it.
In this video, does Mr. Burns tell you emphatically that you have the wrong guy?
Never.
Did he ever say to you, this must be some kind of mistake?
No.
The prosecution plays its final card with a surprise witness from inside the county jail where Burns had been held since his arrest. His cellmate turned informant, Michael Allison. Allison says Burns called him son and even signed a copy of the Cedar Rapids newspaper with a front-page story about the Martinko murder case.
It says, to my favorite son, Michael, Jerry Burns.
But the informant's most damning testimony suggests Burns felt he got away with it.
Has Mr. Burns discussed with you his feelings regarding the potential outcome of his trial?
Yeah, he feels like no matter what happens in this case, that he wins because he had the opportunity to be out there with his family all these years.
No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
But for all the talk about 40 years earlier, it's the advances in DNA that are at the heart of the trial. And nothing will be more important than Michelle's dress, brought into the courtroom on a mannequin by Detective Denlinger to show the jury where the DNA that matched Jerry Burns' sample had been located.
There's a 1 in 100 billion chance that it would be somebody else.
The lawyer for Jerry Burns knows what he's up against.
There was no disputing that there was evidence of Jerry Burns' DNA at the crime scene, but the question was, how did it get there? When did it get there?
So it's the job of the defense's only witness, forensic consultant Dr. Michael Spence, to make sure the jury understands what's known as the DNA transfer theory.
It can be from coughs, sneezes, speaking as I'm doing right now. I'm sure my DNA is right here on this microphone.
And then 2 hours into his testimony, Dr. Spence is asked the pivotal question.
Is it, Dr. Spence, a plausible explanation that the DNA of Jerry Burns found on the dress or on the gear shift could have come about by a transfer?
Objection. Your Honor, that is speculation. There's no evidence in the record to suggest that, and no foundation to make that opinion, expert or otherwise.
The witness will be permitted to respond, answer the question, the hypothetical question.
Was it plausible that Jerry Burns' DNA ended up on Michelle Martinko's dress by some sort of innocent transfer?
Yes, that's a distinct possibility.
On day 9, both sides make closing arguments.
At this time, ladies and gentlemen, it is the time in the trial for each of the parties to present what's called a closing argument.
And I wanted to bring the jury into the story of where these two lives, these two people, intersected that night.
He saw her leaving and he followed her. She's taken by surprise, but she knows that she has to fight. He knows he now must eliminate her because she can identify him. Meanwhile, the killer would be able to go on with his life, raise his family, run a business, enjoy those years, no doubt haunted by the prospect of one day receiving a knock on the door that would eventually come.
Prosecutor Nick Maybanks replays for the jury the video of the day that knock finally came.
Hey, how are you today? Jerry, my name's Matt. Nice to meet you.
How would you act if somebody came and said your DNA was on the crime scene, started implying you in a murder? Well, you know what I'd do? I'd say I didn't do it. You got the wrong guy. Not, I don't know. I don't think anything happened. I don't think so.
And the prosecutor knows he has the DNA evidence on his side, scoffing at the theory that Burns' DNA was somehow transferred to Michelle's dress by accident.
It's not reasonable. It's not founded in the evidence, and quite frankly, it's not even within the realm of possibilities. The evidence shows, beyond any reasonable doubt, the defendant killed Michelle Martinko. The state of Iowa is asking you to enter a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree.
Thank you, Mr. Maybanks.
But the prosecution case seems to have a glaring hole.
Mike Korobanek, you're a former prosecutor. It's tough to prosecute a case against a defendant with only DNA and no really clear motive for this defendant to have killed this victim.
I couldn't agree with you more.
The jury is not shown what prosecutors wanted to present as a motive. Disturbing internet searches discovered on Jerry Burns' computer about assault, rape, and murder, such as blonde molested after getting strangled, and sex with a freshly dead person.
There was indeed a motive, a pathological need to kill and to gain personal pleasure from the act of killing.
But Burns' lawyer, Leon Spies, fights successfully to keep the graphic computer searches from being used as evidence in the trial.
We didn't think it was strong evidence of a motive.
And with the computer searches kept out of the case, Spies is able to argue there was no evidence of a motive for this family man to target Michelle Martinko.
He is a characteristic small-town Iowa businessman with a great group of children in his family. He's kind of the spitting image of a true Hawkeye.
The biggest hurdle for the defense is still the DNA evidence linking Burns to Michelle's dress. And Spies reminds the jury of his expert witness's testimony about how DNA can be transferred and is not infallible.
This is not just phony stuff or something that was made up. This is important scientific information that's invaluable and necessary for your critical appraisal of all of the evidence in this case.
And then finally, to those damning police interrogation tapes of Jerry Burns.
Much has been made about whether or not Jerry, in being questioned by investigator Denlinger, denied that he had killed Michelle Martinko.
Why did this happen, Jerry?
Test the DNA.
What happened?
I don't know. I was not there that night.
You don't know why this happened?
I was not there that night.
I was not there that night. It cannot be said, with your allegiance to the law and the facts, that Jerry Burns is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Your verdict must be not guilty.
The jury retires late in the day. Even the lead detective, Matt Denlinger, worries the prosecution case has issues.
Lack of witnesses, lack of a confession, lack of other things that connected Jerry to the crime scene or to Michelle.
I've seen quick juries, I've seen juries that take longer, and I've seen hung juries.
This is a quick jury.
After about 3 hours of deliberations, the jury reached this verdict.
The members of the jury, through the foreman, have signed verdict form number 1. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jerry Lynn Burns, guilty of the charge of murder in the first degree.
We were hugging each other, just joy, excitement, relief. Oh my goodness, relief.
In the wake of Burns' conviction, questions are raised in Iowa about whether he could be linked to other unsolved murders and disappearances in the state.
I field calls about that to this day. People calling in, suspecting Jerry's somehow responsible for other crimes. And I'm open to that idea.
Including the unsolved disappearance of an Iowa TV news anchorwoman in 1995.
And if you take a picture of Michelle and of Jody Huisentruit, and you put them side by side, they're twins.
And what about the unsolved disappearance of his cousin, Brian Burns, Michelle's friend from the mall, Kurt Thomas?
Brian, his own cousin, he disappeared off the face of the earth on December 19th on the anniversary of Michelle's murder.
Burns' lawyer says there's no evidence of any connection to any other crimes committed by his client whatsoever.
Well, I think it's bizarre how a person could do something so brutal and not have other instances of doing something.
After a delay because of the COVID-19 pandemic, Jerry Burns, in his orange prison jumpsuit and wearing a mask, is back in court to hear his sentence. There is no death penalty in Iowa, and he gets the maximum possible.
Jerry Lynn Burns, you are now remanded to the director of the Iowa Department of Corrections for the rest of your life.
Even so, Michelle's family is not fully satisfied with the outcome.
I think he did get away with it. I would have liked to have seen him spend the rest of his life in prison starting with age 26, but it didn't happen, and I'm at peace with that because we're just glad they caught him. We thought we'd die not knowing who did it.
But finally, 4 decades later, they do.
She's forever 18. You know, she's forever just that beautiful person.
Killer Cases, the podcast, is a production of the Law and Crime Network and Vault Studios. You can watch Killer Cases on the A&E Network and the True Crime Network. Refer to your local programming guide for full details. Brian Weiss, John Ford, and Will Johnson are executive producers with Vault Studios. Reed Redman and Will Johnson produced and edited the podcast. Killer Cases, the television series, is written and presented by me, Brian Ross, and produced and directed by Rhonda Schwartz. Executive producers are myself, Brian Ross, and Rhonda Schwartz with Ellsworth Productions, and Rachel Stockman and Dan Abrams with Law and Crime Productions. Also thanks to producers Sam Kelly and Jennifer Tinter, and editors Danny Hilton and Mick Teodori. Killer Cases is produced in partnership with Cineflex Rights and True Crime Network.